We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Beis and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 87b. Rabbi Lazar is in the middle of asking a contradiction from our Mishnah to a Mishnah in Meseches Trumos. Again, our Mishnah said that if a seller is selling, let's say, oil to a buyer, and he pours out the requisite amount, you're supposed to pour out an extra 3 drops after you're emptying the vessel. So then whatever is left in the vessel of the seller, whatever collects, that belongs to the seller because he's already poured out the requisite amount for the buyer. And so Rabbi Lazar asks now Vatnan, but we learned in a Mishnah in Meseches Trumas, and this Mishnah has very similar language to our Mishnah. It says here, China umitzah, the case over here is he's pouring out some truma from a vessel, and then whatever is left after he poured out the requisite amount, whatever is left and remaining in the original vessel, he tilts it and it's gathering together. Harezu truma. So here the Mishnah says the opposite. The Mishnah says that doesn't belong to the balabayas, it doesn't belong to the owner. Rather, it's considered to be truma. It still has the status of truma, even though he poured out the requisite amount. That therefore is a contradiction to what was said in our Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said back to him, Itmar Allah, it was stated on this, meaning on our Mishnah, it's already been explained why the seller is able to keep whatever is left, because we said, Amar Rabbi Avo said on our Mishnah, Mishum Yish Bailim Naguba, the reason why the seller is allowed to keep whatever is remaining is because of Yish Bailim, because the owners give up hope. Essentially, the buyer never intends to acquire whatever is extra and left at the bottom of the barrel, let's say, that's being poured, and so therefore that's why the seller is able to keep that amount that has nothing to do with what's going on in Meseches Trumos, as the Rashbam explains, Mishum Yish Bailim, Shahalokeach Misiyayish, because a buyer, he gives up, Umafgir Oso Mitzo, he renders ownerless whatever is left over at the bottom of the barrel. He doesn't want to sit there waiting until every little drop is poured out, so you pour out the entire vessel and an extra 3 drops, and then that's it. Aval Truma, but when it comes to Truma, Lo Shayach Yush, it's not even relevant to talk about giving up, to Mikol Makam Truma, because still, he said that everything in this vessel is Truma, Vasur Lazarman, it's forbidden to non-Kohanim, there's no idea of Yish over here. Once it's called Truma, it's Truma, and that's why the Mishnah Meseches Truma says that it is in fact considered Truma. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, it said that a storekeeper does not need to pour out these extra 3 drops every time. It would take too long. He's serving too many customers. And then at the very end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that on Erev Shabbos, when Shabbos is coming, you also don't need to do this. And the Gemara asks, the following question. Rabbi Yehuda Areisha, is Rabbi Yehuda going on the beginning of the Mishnah, Ulakul, in which case he'd be saying a leniency, meaning he's not talking about a storekeeper. He's talking about any regular person who does need to pour the 3 extra drops. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying any person who normally does need to pour these 3 extra drops, but on Erev Shabbos, when Shabbos is coming, you don't need to do that. That would be a leniency, if we understand Rabbi Yehuda in that fashion. Odilma Aseifa Koyer, maybe Rabbi Yehuda is going on the Seif, he's going on the end of the Mishnah, meaning he's going on the case of the storekeeper. We said that there's an exemption for a storekeeper, he never needs to pour these extra 3 drops, and Rabbi Yehuda is coming with L'chumra. Rabbi Yehuda is coming and he's being strict and saying that's only true on Erev Shabbos. But if it's not Erev Shabbos, even the storekeeper has to pour the extra drops. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here, a proof to Tanya, because we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says, Erev Shabbos im chashecha, on Erev Shabbos, when Shabbos is coming, chenvani pater, then it's specifically the storekeeper who's exempt, and that means to say the storekeeper is only exempt on Erev Shabbos, mimnesha chenvani tard, because the storekeeper is very busy, and that would mean that Rabbi Yehuda is really saying a chumrah. The Tanakam is saying that a storekeeper is always exempt, and Rabbi Yehuda is saying that exemption applies to a storekeeper only on Erev Shabbos. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hasholeach es beno etzel chenvani, if somebody sends his son, we're talking here about a son who is a minor, he sends his son to a storekeeper, upundion biyado, and the son has in his hands a pundion is a coin, it's worth 2 iser, umadad lo be'iser shemen, v'nasan lo eso iser, and so the storekeeper, he gives him an iser worth of oil, he pours it into a jug, and then he gives him an iser of change, and he sends this son back to bring the oil and the change back to the father. And then the Mishnah continues, Shavar Satzluchis, let's say the son, he breaks the jug, V'yavad esa iser, he loses the iser. So the Tanakama says, Chenvani chayiv, the storekeeper is chayiv, he's obligated in this case because he really gave it to somebody who's not considered responsible. It's the storekeeper's fault, and he's going to be liable. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Yehuda poter, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the storekeeper is poter. Shal menas kein sholcha, because it was with that understanding that he sent the son. The father sent the son so that the son should be a shliach. He trusted his son to bring back the oil, to bring back the change, and therefore the storekeeper is going to be exempt according to Rabbi Yehuda. And the Mishnah continues, Umodim chachamim Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim would admit to Rabbi Yehuda that indeed the storekeeper is exempt in the following scenario. Bisman shatzluchis biyad hatinok. If the child was sent with the jug, umadad chedvani l'socha, and then the storekeeper poured into the jug that the child was sent with, so then already shechenvani pater. Then even the Tanakama would admit, the Chachamim would admit that the storekeeper is pater, is exempt in that case, because it's clear that that's what the father wanted the storekeeper to do. And the Rashbam explains, it said at the end of the Mishnah, Modim Chachamim Rabbi Yehuda Shechenvani Pater, the Chachamim admit to Rabbi Yehuda in a situation where the father sends the child with a jug, so then the storekeeper is Pater, and the Rashbam says, Bitzlochis Levad, it means to say the storekeeper is Pater on the jug alone. Aval B'Shemen V'Isr Chai, but he still is Chai for the oil and for the loss of the coin. Hachi Garsinim Peirish, Rabbeinu Chananel V'Svarim Yishanim. The Rashbam says this is the text in Rabbeinu Chananel and in the old Svarim. And the Gemara says, B'Shlama B'Isr V'Shemen, I understand by the coin and by the oil. Baha Pligi, so the Machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah is as follows. The Rabbanan Savri La'odoe Shadri, the Rabbanan hold that the father sent the son just to let the storekeeper know what he wanted. He didn't expect that the storekeeper would send the product back with the child, and that's why the storekeeper is responsible. Rabbi Yehuda Savri L'Shadure L'Shadri, and Rabbi Yehuda holds no. He sent the child in order that the child should return with the merchandise. And so therefore, essentially, the father wanted the storekeeper to give it to the son, and that's why the storekeeper is not responsible, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Elashavar tzluchis, but when it comes to the breaking of the jug, so aveda midasi, right now the Gemara is assuming that the father is sending the jug with the child to the storekeeper. That's an aveda midas. The father essentially threw it away himself because he gave it to a child that wasn't responsible. So why should the storekeeper be responsible for that tzluchis? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Hoshia says, Hacha bebal habayis mocher tzlochios askinon. Over here, we're actually dealing with a bal habayis, meaning the father is actually somebody who sells jugs. That's what he does. What's actually happening over here is that the storekeeper took the jug from the child to inspect it, to see if it was good, to see if he wanted to buy it from the father. That's actually what was going on. It's like Shmuel says, Shmuel says, if somebody takes a vessel from a craftsman in order to inspect it, so at that time, then something happens, then something happens, an accident happens and it breaks, so chayiv, so the person is chayiv, he essentially becomes like a borrower at that moment, and that's exactly what's happening in this Mishnah. He's becoming like a borrower of the tzlochis, and that's why he's responsible. But the Gemara says, Leima de Shmuel Tanoihi, but one second, that would mean that Shmuel is actually, what Shmuel said is actually Machlokas Tanoim. Should we say that's a Machlokas Tanoim? Because it's a Machlokas Tanoim in our Mishnah. Again, this was a Machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda, whether or not the storekeeper is responsible. So if we're saying there's a Machlokas Tanoim, whether the storekeeper is responsible for the tzlochis as well, that would mean there's a Machlokas Tanoim in what Shmuel discussed. And so the Gemara continues, El Rabba v'Rav Yosef Damri Tarvayu, rather, Rabba and Rav Yosef, they both say, Hacha b'chenvani mocher tzlochios askin. And what's actually happening over here is we're talking about a storekeeper who sells jugs. V'yazder Rabbi Yehuda l'taimei v'Rabbanan l'tamayu, and Rabbi Yehuda is following his opinion, and the Rabbanan are following their opinion, meaning to say, according to the Rabbanan, so we assume that the father just sent the child in order to let the storekeeper know what he wanted, and therefore he should not have been sending things back with the child, and that applies to the tzlochis as well. That applies to the jug as well. And Rabbi Yehuda says no, he sent him in order to bring back the merchandise, and therefore there's an expectation that he gives it to him in a jug, and that's why the storekeeper is not responsible. And the Rashbam explains, Hacha b'chenvani mocher tzlochios. Here we're talking about a storekeeper who sells jugs. V'hach tzlochis demasnisin, and the jug we're talking about in the Mishnah, shal chenvani, belongs to the storekeeper. Shasholach lo bal habayis hadamim biyad beno liknos tzlochis mimenu. The bal habayis actually sent money with the son to buy the jug as well. And to bring oil in the jug. Therefore, the tzlochis is not something that was essentially thrown away by the father. And so each one is following his opinion. The Rabbanan follow their opinion. They say by the coin and by the oil, the storekeeper is chayiv. The idea just was the child was letting the storekeeper know what his father wanted. He was supposed to send it with someone responsible. The same is true when it comes to the jug. Rabbi Yehuda follows his opinion. He sent his son that his son should bring these things back. He should bring the jug back, and he should bring the oil back and the coin back. The son was supposed to do that, and therefore the storekeeper is not responsible. But the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if so, if that's the case, Seifa, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Modim Chachamim l'Rabbi Yehuda bizman shatzlochis biad hatinok. The Chachamim would admit to Rabbi Yehuda that if the jug is in the hands of the child, umadad chenvani l'socha, and the storekeeper is measuring into it, shechenvani pater, that the storekeeper is pater. And so the Gemara asks, Va'amrit, but you said, lo doe shadre, that according to the Chachamim, the child is just being sent to let the chenvani know what the father wants, but the chenvani should not be sending things with the child. And so why suddenly, just because he's pouring it into the tzlochis while the child is holding it, suddenly the chenvani is not responsible? And the Rashbam here explains, V'amrid lo doe shadre, you said that he's just sending the child to let him know. V'lo hayalo limsor atzlochis livno shel balabayis. He shouldn't have given over the jug to the child of the balabayis. Now Toz is over here, no, tihachi maseifa. In the question of the Gemara, it said, if so, look at the end of the Mishnah. Umodim chacham l'Rabbi Yehuda. Again, the chacham admit to Rabbi Yehuda that if the child is holding the tzlochis, the Rabba v'Rav Yosef. So Toz say that Rabba and Rav Yosef, who don't have this question, they say that they can understand the seifa. Savri, they hold bizman shatzlochis biyad hatinok. When the Mishnah says that the tzlochis, the jug, is in the hands of the child, dahainu shehiviyah mi beis aviv, that means that he brought the jug from his father's house. In other words, Rabba and Rav Yosef, they understand that in the first part of the Mishnah, the jug actually belonged to the storekeeper, and he's sending essentially the child is buying the jug along with the oil, and he's sending everything back with the child. And so there's a machlokas tanoim whether or not the storekeeper is responsible. But in the seifa of the Mishnah, so there Rabbi and Rav Yosef would say that the jug actually came from the house of the father. The father sent the child with the jug, and that's why he's exempt. That's why the storekeeper is not responsible for the jug. It's essentially an aveda midas in that case. The father gave the jug over to this irresponsible child. But the Gemara is not understanding like Rabbi and Rav Yosef. The Gemara is understanding that we're talking at the end of the Mishnah also, the jug belongs to the chenvani, and that's why the Gemara is asking, who cares that he pours it while the child is holding the jug? Why is that a reason to be exempt? And we'll take a look over here as well at the Mosif Tosfos says, well, why is the Gemara asking the question? Why not just explain the end of the Mishnah the way Rabbi and Rav Yosef would explain? That at the end of the Mishnah we're talking about a jug that belonged to the father. And so the Mosif Tosfos says, had the Gemara went with that explanation, there's extra words there. You don't have to say that the storekeeper measured into it. Why is that important? It seems like that's an important part of the discussion at the end of the Mishnah, and so that's why the Gemara understands that's the reason for the exemption, but why should that be a reason for an exemption? Again, the child was just sent to inform the storekeeper. Why is the storekeeper sending anything back with the child? In any case, the Gemara continues, Abaya Baravin, Reb Chanina Baravin, Damri Tarvayu, Abaya Baravin and Chanina Baravin, they both say, Hacham Mayaskin, and here what are we dealing with? And the Rashbam explains, Abaya Baravin, Reb Chanina Baravin, Damri Tarvayu, again, Abaya Baravin and Reb Chanina Baravin, they both say, Lo Tukma Lo Bechanvani Mocher Tzlochios, Velo Balabayis Mocher Tzlochios. We're not talking about a storekeeper who's selling jugs, and we're not talking about a balabayis who's selling jugs. And what we're talking about here is you have a jug that is designated for measuring purposes, and the storekeeper takes this jug from the child to measure with it, for the child. Now, even though in this case it's an aveda midas, the father gave it to the child, essentially it's like throwing it away, but still, once the storekeeper takes it, he becomes chayiv to watch over it until he returns it to the hands of the balabayis, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Peches Amud Aleph.